Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Sherwin, the International Approvals Project Manager here at Vista Laboratories. Today is June 20th, 2019, and as part of our International Approvals and Webinar series, we will be going over market access in South America for electronics and wireless products. We'll specifically be focused on going over the radio type approval and equipment homologation schemes of countries in South America such as Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Venezuela, most of the countries. There's no one certificate for all of the countries in South America. So today we'll be providing a brief introduction, process, and requirements to the biggest countries in South America in the field of electronic and wireless devices. So without further ado, let's begin. So looking at a brief overview of the agenda for today, the different type approval authorities in these countries, starting from the top left: Argentina, ENACOM; Bolivia, ATT; Brazil, ANATEL; Chile, SUBTEL; Colombia, CRC; Ecuador, ARCOTEL; Paraguay, CONATEL; Peru, MTC; Uruguay, URSEC; and Venezuela, CONATEL. So these type approval authorities set out mandatory requirements for radio equipment in order for them to be distributed and marketed for sale in their country. There's other regulatory bodies within these countries, and different authorities and different regulations may pertain to your equipment depending on what is involved in your specific equipment. But if your equipment is an electronic device with radio frequency or telecommunications capabilities, then these regulatory authorities will certainly have mandatory requirements for your product to be imported through customs and distributed for sale within the country. So ENACOM is the first regulatory body that we'll be talking about today. They are in charge of the standardization of communications equipment in Argentina, and one of their main functions is to approve both equipment that makes use of the radioelectric spectrum, including those of broadcasting, as well as the communications equipment that connect to public networks. So for this, we need to ensure compliance of the equipment as well as the processes of the manufacturer in order for them to market their device in the country. So the standardization is based on the issuance of type approvals based on various technical requirements pertaining to user safety, efficiency of the use of the radio spectrum, and ensuring compatibility with authorized networks and communication systems. So ENACOM type approvals are a mandatory requirement for any device that connects to telephone lines, such as telephone, fax, or modem, or utilize the radio frequency spectrum for the transmission of information, such as cordless phones, wireless routers, cell phones, and Bluetooth devices. This includes, obviously, information technology equipment, such as computer systems or smartphones, or any other electronic devices that incorporate wireless technology. So what are the different certification schemes or type approval schemes in Argentina? So for radio and electronic products, there are 3 certification schemes for certifying equipment and obtaining permission to market and or use it in the national territory of Argentina: homologation, codification or coding, and authorization. So homologation is the verification that it's a formal compliance verification and certification based on the applicable CNC standards. This is the most common scheme, and Argentina does not accept foreign test reports except for FCC or CE test reports for GSM technology. Codification is similar to homologation, but for equipment that does not have specific technical standards set out already. Equipment undergoes verification, but this is without any in-country testing, and this is much less common. The last scheme is authorization, and it's essentially a use permit that restricts the use to a single person or entity. and normally only applicable when importing equipment specific to individual specified usage applications. The information corresponding to the approval is either approval through homologation, coding, or authorization will be recorded in the materials register. So basic information such as your manufacturer name, products, operating frequency, etc., will be available publicly. Certifications are valid for 3 years and they can be renewed. So a brief look at the certification requirements that we will need from the applicant. In terms of testing, it generally must be done in country, and FCC CE test reports are not accepted. Samples can range from 1 to 3 samples depending on the complexity of the equipment and the requirement, and the lead time is 6 to 8 weeks and can also depend on the complexity of the equipment. Documentation, product specification, and technical data sheet is required. User manual is required. Sales brochure, schematics, block diagram, circuit layout are required. Internal, external photos showing the manufacturer's information and identification, as well as the model number of the equipment is required. Test setup instructions are also needed. In Argentina, a local representative is required for ENACOM radio homologation, meaning a local entity must be present to receive the certificate. So the applicant must be the local importer, and only Argentine importers can homologate the equipment. As mentioned before, certificates are valid for 3 years, and renewals are permitted. For renewals, there's no additional testing required, and the certificate number does not change. And generally, renewals only take about 4 to 6 weeks, and you will need to have a declaration that there's no change in your renewed equipment. And if there's a change, then retesting if it's likely to be required. Now we'll look at product labeling. There are a few requirements in Argentina under ENACOM. It's mandatory product marking for all radio equipment. All equipment must bear the CNC mark, as you see there, and I'm following the numbering instructions. So anything that's not complying with this is considered a non-registered device. And this includes radio modules. So the CNC label and homologation number, if it's not possible to be put on the device, for example, if the device is too small, then the label and homologation number can be printed on the user manual and packaging. Host equipment must state the CNC ID, and labeling is allowed. Some other requirements: the label should be printed permanently and visible and legible. The minimum font size is 3 points, trademark and model number is required, and the serial number is required. In the case of modular equipment, they should still have their own CNC label and homologation number, and the external part of the module, equipment radio module, should be marked, and there should be a reference to that module. Again, the same labeling requirements apply. So that was a brief introduction to the Radio Type Approval Authority of Argentina, and now we will be moving to Bolivia. So ATT is the Regulation and Enforcement Authority for Telecommunications and Transport in Bolivia. They mandate type approval requirements for wireless and telecom products, meaning every radio frequency device needs ATT type approval, and every telecommunications equipment will need ATT type approval unless there is an exemption for the device. So, for example, radio frequency devices, if there is a frequency exemption for the device's operational frequency, then it may be exempt. So for some examples, let's see: modems, wireless telephones, transceivers, terminals, television broadcasting, etc., other transceivers and transmitters. So the purpose of this is to verify the compatibility of the operation of the equipment with a telecommunications network according to national standards, as well as the international standards adopted in Bolivia. So quickly moving on to the certification requirements in Bolivia under ATT rules. We can obtain the certificate of conformity without any local testing required. Normally, there's no local testing, and we can just simply use the existing reports, the CE and the FCC reports, to obtain the certificate of conformity. Again, the CE and FCC reports are acceptable reports for the submission process. And in general, the lead time is 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the product complexity. And a local representative is not required under ATT's rules in order to obtain the certificate of conformity. The certificate is valid for 5 years, and there are no labeling requirements for the product. There are also no family grouping rules, so each product will require an individual certificate. So for products that do not require the ATT type approval, the agency can issue a letter to have for your records to avoid any issues with customs, stating that the equipment is exempt and type approval does not apply. This will prevent any issues upon customs and importation of the equipment into Bolivia. Okay, so that was a quick introduction for ATT in Bolivia, and now let's move on to ANATEL in Brazil. ANATEL is the National Telecommunications Agency of Brazil. They promote the development of Brazil's telecommunications infrastructure through standardization, equipment homologation, as well as surveillance. Products that connect to the public telephone network, as well as use radio frequency, use the radio frequency spectrum, are required to be certified and receive the type approval by ANATEL. Such as these can be Bluetooth Zigbee products, satellite products, network switches. All of these fall under mandatory certification and require radio equipment homologation in order to be commercialized in Brazil. As you can see, there's 3 categories of products: Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3. Category 1 is for terminal equipment intended for use by the general public for the purposes of accessing what they call the collective interest telecommunication services. Category 2 is for products which make use of the electromagnetic spectrum for the transmission of signals. This will include products with antennas and utilize the radio frequency spectrum. And they will classify these as restricted radiation radio communication equipment. Category 3 is anything that does not fall under the above 2 categories and still need to assure the interoperability of networks that support telecommunication services. Also need to assure the reliability of networks that support telecommunication services, as well as assuring the electromagnetic compatibility and electrical safety. So again, so product category 3 can be, so for example, cordless phones, wireless phones, fax modem machines. In this case, so there's different validities for these 3 different product categories. Category 1 is only valid for 1 year and will require product testing and evaluation of the factory's quality system. Category 2, some examples are transmitters, transceivers, RF devices, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, RFID, etc. This certificate is valid for 2 years and will require in-country product testing. So category 3 equipment, again, is not contained in the definitions of 1 and 2. This actually will also require product testing, but the certificate is valid until the regulation changes or the device is modified. This will include interconnection, network equipment, switches, hubs, gateways that are not included in category 1 and 2. So there are multiple certification schemes or conformity assessment schemes in Brazil. The first is Declaration of Conformity. So this conformity assessment scheme is applicable only to homemade products intended for individual use, and it does not grant the right to or authorize the commercialization of the product within the country. The second is the Declaration of Conformity with an accompanying test report. So this is for an exceptional case such as new technology where it may take more than 3 months for authorization and issuance of a Declaration of Conformity. The third is certification of conformity, so not a declaration but a certification based on type approval tests. This is for category 3 equipment, telecommunication products. Next is certification of conformity based on specific tests and periodic assessments of the product. Category 2 telecommunication products will fall under this certification scheme. Lastly, certification of conformity with quality system assessment, category 1 telecommunication products. So there's actually 2 certificates for telecommunication radio devices. One is the ANATEL homologation certificate. This is directly issued by ANATEL and there's no expiration date. This is issued to the local representative. The next is an OCD technical certificate. This is issued by a OCD, which is a designated certification body and has an expiration date. So those are the validity dates that you see there for product categories 1, 2, and 3. And this is typically issued to the owner of the design, also known as the manufacturer. So product category 1 is valid for 12 months, and category 2 is valid for 24 months, and category 3 does not have an expiration date. So for renewals, in-country testing, again, is not required. So for the original certification, it is, but for renewals, it is not, unless there is a product change, or there's a regulation change, or if there was any test failures in the original homologation, or there's new safety requirements. Samples are required for testing, and some other documents we may need are internal and external photos, as well as a declaration letter from the manufacturer confirming that no modifications has occurred since the original approval. So for renewals, as I said, there's 2 certificates. So the ANATEL issued certificate does not change, but the OCD technical certificate issued by the certification body will be renewed. So after briefly discussing the renewals, let's talk about the actual certification requirements for the initial equipment homologation. So again, testing must be done in country. FCCC test reports are not able to be accepted, and obviously samples are required, test setup instructions are required. In terms of the documentation, authorization letter, manufacturer, applicant, factory information, internal, external photos, product label with the location of the ANATEL logo, placement, technical specifications, the user manual in Portuguese language. This is mandatory, and so if the product is destination is for an end user, then the Portuguese language is mandatory. And if the product is not will not be sold directly to the general public, will not be commercialized with the general public as the audience, then an English or Spanish version of the manual is acceptable. So if it will not be sold to an end user, then it will additionally require a declaration of product technical use, stating that it won't be for the end user and allowing the English or Spanish manual. Other than that, schematics, block diagrams. So if an electrical schematic can't be provided or block diagrams cannot be provided due to confidentiality reasons, then another declaration will be required, declaring that the electrical schematic is confidential. Assembly factories quality evaluation, or ISO 9001:2015 certificate. So this is the newer year certificate, will be required. So if you are trying to certify family models, then a declaration of similarity letter will be required. And this is a case-by-case basis. We'll need to present comparison pictures, as well as this letter of similarity explaining the differences and similarities between the models. And so for example, if they use the same radio frequency module, it's possible we can perform testing for one of the models and just a few additional tests for the other models. And this is, but on a case-by-case basis, we will need to check if family grouping is acceptable or allowed. And there's other application forms we need. as well. And in Brazil, local representative is required for the certificate. Lastly, let's take a look at the labeling requirements of ANATEL. Homologated products or type-approved products must have ANATEL's identification seal or logo legibly and indelibly affixed to them. As you can see there, that is the required logo and label. The HHHH identifies the product's authorization through the numerical series of characters, and the AA is the year, and the FFFFF is the identification of the product manufacturer. An additional statement is required on the user manual, and in the case of the label being too small, we can issue another letter asking for only to put the ANATEL ID on the product and the complete label on the user manual. And other user manual warning statements may apply. Okay, that was the first 3 countries. Now we are moving to Chile, SUBTEL. So SUBTEL is the Telecommunications Authority of Chile. They mandate type approval requirements for wireless and telecommunications devices. Their main function is to propose national policies in telecommunications matters in accordance with the government's guidelines and to exercise the direction and control of implementation. They supervise public and private companies in various sectors, including radio and telecommunications within Chile, and they also control compliance with relevant laws, regulations, and standards. So any product using radio frequency, cellular, or satellite technology require approval and certification to be commercialized in Chile. Some examples are wireless telephones, RFID products, equipment uses radar systems in vehicles, as well as Zigbee devices. So what are the certification requirements for SUBTEL radio or telecommunications type approval? So for radio frequency equipment, luckily in-country testing is not required. But for telecommunications equipment, so meaning hardwired devices that actually connect to the telecommunications network, such as analog telephones or fax machines, must actually be tested in country. And obviously test setup instructions will be required and samples will be required in that case. In terms of the documentation, we'll need a certificate. So the FCC or CE, any formal certificate or grant issued by internationally recognized certification body, and they have a list of what they accept. Test reports applied to the equipment to be approved, photographs of the equipment to be approved, the user manual, technical description. So local representative is not required for the SUBTEL radio type approval, and there is no modular approval, so only certifications for end user products. Lead time to obtain this would be 30 days roughly, and the validity is permanent, so renewals will not be necessary. Family models is allowed. You can have maximum, I think, up to 8 models per certificate, and this is only if the test report shows all the models on there, and if they have the same output power. So if the product is modified, in that case, then that would be the only situation where you would need to recertify. Generally, the validity is permanent, but if you make any changes, then you will need recertification. There's no labeling requirements unless it's a wireless device that requires SAR measurement. So normally cell phone devices. So for those products, a SUBTEL certification number must be on the label, preceded by the acronym SUBTEL, SUBTEL. Okay, so now we will be moving on to Colombia CRC. So CRC is the Telecommunications Regulatory Commission of Colombia. They regulate all voice cellular products, satellite equipment, and products that communicate and connect to the PSTN or the public switch telephone network. So all of these will require CRC certification. Most radio frequency equipment actually do not require approval in Colombia at this time. So for those products that are exempt from approval, you can obtain a letter of voluntary approval from the CRC. stating that the product is exempt from the type approval requirements and can be imported and sold in Colombia to avoid any issues in the importation phase. Certificates do not expire and renewals are not necessary unless obviously the equipment changes and the radio frequency properties change. So what are the certification requirements? Testing is not required. Documentation certificate issued by a certification body. So a certificate of compliance of technical standards issued by a certification body or an accredited laboratory. The certificate must state, for example, for a cell phone, must comply with the relevant FCC technical standards, Part 22, so Part H, and FCC Part 24, or a technical equivalent. So the certificate must also certify that the equipment complies with the exposure limits established in IEEE Standard C95.1 or ICNIRP ICNIRP on safety levels with respect to human exposure to radio frequency electromagnetic fields. Another requirement is a copy of the user manual or documentation with technical specs for the specific equipment model, including the frequency range and the output power range in which it operates. Labeling specifications of the equipment to verify the relationship between terminal equipment model in reference and the associated FCC compliance certification code. Local representation is not required, and cover letter application is also necessary. Lead time 4 to 6 weeks for mandatory telecommunication products and 1 to 2 weeks for voluntary products such as radio frequency products. There are no logo or marking requirement mandatory for CRC. Moving on to Ecuador, ARCOTEL. ARCOTEL is the agency for regulation and control for telecommunications of Ecuador. So equipment homologation is mandatory for wireless and telecommunication products, and the objective of this is to prevent damage to telecommunications networks, avoid technical disturbance to telecommunication services or deteriorate their services, and avoid harmful interference to the radio spectrum. And obviously this contributes to the quality of the provision of telecommunication services in Ecuador. So its equipment is exempt, and voluntary approval letters can be obtained if desired. And the exemption criteria is the output transmit power of any radio device is below 50 milliwatts EIRP. So for anything with power higher than that, certification is mandatory. And below is an example of the terminal equipment that require mandatory equipment homologation. So looking at the certification requirements for ARCOTEL in Ecuador, in-country testing is no longer required if the ARCOTEL recognized certificate is available. And if the equipment certification does not correspond to any of the accepted international organizations, then in-country testing would be mandatory. So in terms of documentation, user manual, technical spec sheet, data sheet, application forms, photos of the equipment, and certificate issued by international organization accepted by ARCOTEL. FCC is on that list and recognized by ARCOTEL. Local representation is not required, and there's no labeling requirements. Certificates do not have an expiration date, and the lead time to obtain this is roughly 4 to 6 weeks. And now we'll be moving on to CONATEL of Paraguay. CONATEL is the National Telecommunications Commission of Paraguay. They are responsible for verifying product compliance with applicable regulations in order to commercialize products in Paraguay. All products that utilize the RF spectrum, as well as equipment that connect to the public network, require type approval and certification. So below is a list of examples. Bluetooth speakers, modems, wireless equipment, RFID equipment will all require mandatory equipment homologation in Paraguay. So as for certification requirements, testing locally in country is not required. No samples are required. Documentation, technical spec data sheet, FCC test report for EMC RF SAR, as applicable, will be required. User manual showing the model and brand is required, and a label showing the CONATEL logo and certification number. So each unit of equipment or telecommunications equipment approved or marketed in Paraguay must have an identification in a visible place, accessible by the user, composed of the equipment manufacturer name, brand of the equipment, model of the equipment, and a label with the logo CONATEL, as well as the registration number or code corresponding to the certificate of the homologation that is granted. So manufacturer must present a graphic or image of the label that will be displayed. So that's the labeling requirement, and specifying where it will be placed on the equipment. No local representative is required. There's no family grouping rules. The certificate is valid for 5 years, and the lead time will take roughly 8 to 10 weeks. Back to the labeling. So there are strict requirements on this. The label must be placed on the product before entrance into the country, and be careful not to make a mistake on the name and address of the supplier of the country. That needs to be included as well. And such information like this can also be put in the user manual, just to be cautious. And the FCC mark or C mark on the label is actually okay to ensure an even smoother entry of the product through the customs import process. After the 5-year validity date is up, renewals can be submitted anytime prior to or after the expiration date. But obviously, if the certificate has already expired, then it cannot be sold until the renewal certificate has been issued and obtained. Now we move on to MTC of Peru. MTC is the Ministry of Transportations and Communications of Peru. They are responsible for the control, supervision, and type approval certification process to assure that devices will properly use the radio frequency spectrum in the country. There's mandatory compliance requirements for wireless and telecom products. RF equipment with rated power greater than 10 milliwatts require homologation certificate. So if it's below that and it operates in unlicensed bands, then approval is actually voluntary. So conformity assessment schemes, there's homologation of radio terminal equipment akin to a certification procedure, and a registration of import equipment that's already been certified by US or Canada, kind of like a registration procedure. So in-country testing is not required for MTC. Data sheet, user manual, FCC, ISCD grant, and report is required. UET photos, company name, address, information, product name, brand name, model. Local representative is not required, and there's no labeling requirements, and the validity is permanent. It takes about 4 to 8 weeks to obtain. So basically, MTC will accept FCC or IC grants as proof of compliance, along with the required submittal documents, and this is enough to obtain the MTC radio equipment homologation. FCC IC marking must be on the product label. Depending on which agency was used, you'll have the FCC or the IC on it, or both. Registration number will be needed by the importer in order to claim the. Now we move on to Uruguay, URSEC. URSEC is the regulatory body for telecommunications approval in Uruguay and responsible for verifying the compliance of telecommunication equipment with applicable regulations in order for commercialization and distribution. So it's mandatory, for example, for mobile phones, computers, and GPS trackers to obtain this approval. In-country testing is not required. Documentation needed, FCC reports. Local representation is not required, no labeling requirements, and is valid for 15 years. Lead time 2 to 4 weeks to obtain. And equipment operating in the 5.4 to 5.7 gigahertz bands are not allowed. Radio module approval is allowed. Any changes to the model name, brand name, applicant name will require new approval. And there's no family model approval. So again, there's no product labeling requirement, but we advise to include the FCC or C marking on the product, and that should generally be there anyways. Depending on which report you use, that will ensure a smoother customs importation process. And lastly, moving on to Venezuela, CONATEL. CONATEL is the National Commission of Telecommunications of Venezuela. They set out mandatory compliance requirements for wireless and telecom products, for example, portable transceivers, mobile phones, transceivers and transmitters, and equipment for data networks. Luckily, in-country testing is also not required for Venezuela under CONATEL. Documentation user guide must be in Spanish. Technical specs are required. Internal external photos, reports from accredited laboratory, and certificates from other countries. So these certificates can be from the USA, Canada, European Union, Brazil, Mexico, Argentina are all acceptable. Local representation is not required, and labeling requirement is only the FCC or CE mark on the product label. Validity is permanent and lead time is 4 to 6 weeks. CONATEL issues a stamped receipt upon receipt of the application package, which the manufacturer can use to start the importation of the product into Venezuela. So this can be done while it's still under the agency review. So they issue something before even the actual certification is done. The agency actually does not provide hard copy certificates. Instead, your product will simply be listed on the CONATEL website. Okay, so that wraps it up for these 10 countries in South America. Hopefully it was an interesting presentation and you learned a little bit to get started and gain a little bit of understanding on the requirements pertaining to your product and market access into these countries. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate you listening in today. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, or any feedback whatsoever, please send it to info@vista-compliance.com. Vista Compliance Laboratories is a independent compliance test lab specializing in electrical and radio wireless field. We're an EMC RF test lab and product certification body for a lot of countries globally, including USA, Canada, and the EU. So if you have any product-specific inquiries, please let us know anytime, and we will try and find the best solution for you and find the most efficient solution to have your products access global markets as soon as possible. So thank you for your time again, and we appreciate you joining us, and feel free to sign up for next month's webinar where we'll be going over Taiwan product compliance and BSMI ROS requirements, as well as the NCC radio equipment approval requirements. Thank you and have a nice day. Bye.